All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Monte Poker, vlog number 48. We have an action-packed episode for you guys today at our usual spot up at Outlaws in Atascadero. And there's really not much of an introduction needed. It was a crazy session, a lot of ups and downs. Oh, and before I forget, we did get some help with editing, but I'll give you guys that update at the end of the episode. Starting off the vlog with a little PLO Bomb Pot action as soon as the game started. Board comes out 9-9-3 with 2 clubs. We don't have any clubs. Well, we have 1 club, but no flush draw, obviously, because you must play 2 in PLO. But we do have a 9 with a good kicker. Only really worried about pocket 3s here or somebody holding 9-3, which is definitely possible. So when a player leads out for 15 here, I can't do anything besides just put in the call. A couple other players come along for the ride, so there's 130 in this pot now. The player that ended up betting the flop decides to continue here and hit the cap or $75. The 4 of spades doesn't really change the board too much. I don't think I can fold our hand here. The other 2 players get out of the way, so we go to this river heads up. Our opponent shows ace-9 offsuit, so at worst case scenario we're chopping, but then we end up rivering a 10 for a full house, so we're actually going to go ahead and scoop this $250 pot. That's pretty ideal. I knew our opponent had a 9, but it was possible that he had a full house, either holding 2 3s or 2 4s, or potentially a 9-4 or 9-3. Worst case scenario, we would have chopped the other player's money, but there wasn't that much of that in there anyway. Either way, it is always good to start the night off with a win. This next hand may have been a bit of a blunder, but I'm curious to see what you guys say. I look down at pocket 8s on the big blind. There is a $10 straddle. A couple players get out of the way, but 2 players do decide to limp. So when the action gets back over to the small blind, they don't think $10 is enough. They decide to bump this up to $65, and now the action is back on me. I could see our opponent doing this with 2 Broadway cards, but I could also see them doing it with a big pair. I could just flat here. Then if we see anything between a 10 to an ace, it's going to be hard to continue on a lot of boards. So I decided to go for a re-raise instead. I decided to make it 165. My intention with this bet sizing was to get our opponent in the small blind to either shove or fold. If he has a hand like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, I expect him to fold. Sometimes he might ship it in with ace king, but I think I would just expect jacks or better if he does decide to go all in here. And the rest of the table folds when the action gets back over to the small blind. He does decide to jam here for 400 and some change, somewhere around 450. I had told myself before he did this that if he jammed, I was just going to fold 8s because a lot of the time I'm just going to be drawing to 2 outs here. Best case scenario, we're coin flipping, but I think a lot of the time he's going to have more combos of 10s, jacks, queens, kings, and aces here than he's going to have ace king. So I do fold reluctantly, and our opponent shows ace king. Not sure if I should have stuck the money in on this one or not. Overall, I was still okay with the fold in the moment, but obviously it feels a little bad when you do see the best case scenario hand. Either way, we were only in for 3, so we're even on the session, but at this point I do decide to add on for 500 because the stacks are a bit deeper now and we don't want to get pushed around. For this next hand, we have a fresh stack of green chips to use. When we look down at pocket 7s, middle position player open to $15. We go ahead and put in the call. We get another couple customers coming along for the ride. 5 of us go to this flop, which comes out an absolute dream 7-9-9 with 2 clubs, flop a full house, and to make matters even better, the big blind decides to bet $15 here. We lose 1 customer. I put in the call. The button puts in the call, and to make matters even better, the small blind decides to re-raise to $50. I end up putting in the call here, but the other 2 players do run away. So there's now 195 in the middle, and we're going to go to this turn heads up. The turn is an ace of hearts. This does bring in ace 9, but when our opponent checks it over, I can't imagine that he has a full house in this spot. And there are plenty of other 9s available, like 8-9, 10-9, 9 jack, maybe even queen 9. So I'm definitely going to continue putting money in this pot. I decide to make it $75 to go. Our opponent thinks it over for a second, but ultimately puts in the call. 345 in the middle, and we go to this river, which comes in 8 of spades. This is a bit concerning because one of the combo of 9s that I was worried about is now there. But after our opponent checks it one more time on this river, I do not expect him to have a full house. I just expect him to have a 9 here a lot of the time. So we're gonna go for value, but I want to keep it small enough for him to call with trips. I go 150 into a pot of 345. Our opponent calls it pretty quickly with 9-10, and we're gonna scoop this $645 pot. If I was putting my opponent on trips, I probably could have gone a lot bigger on the river, but since it's still the start of the session and we haven't played any big pots, I wasn't sure if our opponent was gonna call a pot size bet this early in the game. A bit of flawed thinking there, because even he himself said that he saved himself money in this pot because he definitely would have played for all of it. But either way, a win is a win, and we're just gonna have to keep that in mind for next time. This hand gets a little unhinged, so we're gonna go ahead and get you guys up to speed. There was a $10 straddle and open to 25, 2 players called, and then the button decided to squeeze up to 125. We looked down at 3-2 suited, and although it is nice, we are definitely not gonna play this for $125 pre-flop, especially out of position. Position doesn't even matter at this point, honestly, it's just too much pre-flop. The original better decides to throw his cards away. The action gets back over to the low jack, and he's thinking about putting in a call. He mulls it over for quite a bit, but then does elect to put in the call. The action gets over to the hijack, who decides to go all in. The button at this point has more than half of his money already committed to the pot, so he puts in the call. Action is back at the low jack, and now he's in a pickle. As he's in the tank, the button shows us his hand. He was going for a squeeze play with 10-7 suited, and pot committed himself. He flashed us his cards for the sweat, and then the low jack eventually does put in the call. So there's 3 people going into this pot. There's 729 in the main and a little bit more left on the side, but not too much. Flop comes out for king 7 with 2 hearts. 2 of diamonds doesn't really change too much here. And then the 10 of hearts gives the button 2 pair. In excitement, he flips over his cards, but we have to play for the side pot first. We get shown pocket queens by villain number 1. Ace 3 offsuit by villain number 2, neither of which are good because the button flopped middle pair and river 2 pair to crack queens and take down this $729 pot. For this next hand, there was a $15 opened by the hijack. Cut off, decided to call the 15. It got back to me on the button, and I decided to make it 30 to make sure the blinds did not come along. Both the previous better and caller both put in the call, so we go to this flop with $94 in the middle. Board runs out ace 8 king rainbow. Action checks over to me, and typically I'd like to bet here, but I'm gonna go ahead and check this back, try to let one of our opponents stab here with potentially just a king. I don't expect either of them to have a stronger ace in this situation. 8 of hearts peels off on the turn. The hijack checks. The button makes it $20 to go. I decide to spring the trap here and make it $60. Thinks it over for a second and then puts in the call. 214 in the middle, and we go to this river, which comes a 10 of hearts. Cutoff now slows down, checks it over to us. I decide to make it $80 to go. Very quickly puts in the call. I flip over my ace jack, and he flips over 8-5 suited. Yikes. Tried to give our opponent some rope to catch up, and they ended up surpassing us on this hand. We gave him a free card on the flop, so he turned trips on our top pair, and unfortunately this $385 pot is going in the wrong direction with our kryptonite hand, no less. But can we really say we're surprised? Not long after that last hand, we looked down at aces in the cutoff and decided to bump it up to $15. The button then decides to click it up to $45 here. We lose the small and the big blind, but when the action gets back to us, we are going nowhere with aces here. We put in the call, and we go to this flop heads up with $94 in the middle. Flop comes out 10 jack 8 with 2 spades. Check it over to the button, who decides to lead out here for $50. Action gets back over to me, and I contemplate raising for a moment, but I think just calling is fine as well. This is a pretty aggressive player. 194 in the middle, 4 of diamonds peels off. I check it one more time over to the button, and he continues here for $110. Now, there's a lot going on this board. There's a straight draw and 2 different flush draws, so I think now is a good time for us to put in the check raise, but I'm debating how much. I don't necessarily want to scare off our opponent just yet, and want to set up a good pot size jam on the river. I decide that a min click is in order and bump it up to 250. which is a little bit more than a min click. A min click would be 220, but you know, the extra $30 doesn't necessarily do too much here. Our opponent goes deep into the tank and thinks it over for multiple minutes here, but eventually does elect to call. So there's 694 in the middle, and we go to this river, and it comes the Jack of Diamonds. So the backdoor flush does get there. And to make things even worse, the top card on the board has now paired. Given the pre-flop action, our opponent could have kings, queens, ace jack, ace king, ace queen. So he's either over this board, just river trips, or has a missed draw. Considering all those possibilities, I decide to fire for 300 here. If he does have the jack, this could be a good sized blocker bet where he might not want to put any more in, considering the board texture is very bad. If he has kings or queens, this should be a small enough bet for him to still put in the call, hopefully. And considering we put half of our money in, I don't think he's going to go for a jam here as a bluff with a missed flush draw or a missed straight draw. So he ends up thinking it over for quite a while. He lines up $300 in chips, which I'm not sure if I'm happy or scared about, to be 100% honest. Gives his cards one more look over, but then eventually does say all right and throws them into the muck. So we end up scooping this $700 pot without having to get to showdown. Playing 5-handed at the moment. There's only 6 on the table and one of them stepped away. So I'm in the cutoff with 8-10 suited. Typically, I'd like to bump this up and raise, but the $7 straddle is on. So I do expect the button to raise this a lot of the time. And raise it, he does indeed. Makes it 27 to go. Small blind ends up folding after calling the 7th. Big blind folds as well. Action gets back over to the hijack, who calls, and obviously we're going nowhere with a hand as strong as this. 3 ways to the flop, $95 in the middle, and the board runs out 9 jack 5 with 2 spades. So we flop an open-ended straight draw, but unfortunately due to the flush draw on the board and the fact that we're not holding any spades, not all of our outs are clean. So the button decides to continue here for $60. I think it's okay putting in the call at least once to see what he does on the turn. It's capable that he's just blending here with the spade draw himself. So after everybody else gets out of the way, we do put in the call, 215 in the middle, and we go to this turn, which comes the 9 of spades. Not really great. I decided to check it on this card and the button checks it back almost immediately. River brings us a 2 of hearts, not really changing too much on this board. Think it over for a bit, pondering whether or not our bluff will get through if we try to steal this pot. After I check the river, the button fires for pretty small here, only $75. Doesn't necessarily seem like a very strong bet. Maybe he just has the jack here. I contemplate going for the check raise on this river, but I know this player is pretty sneaky. He's very capable. Could have checked back the flush once he connected on the turn and is just going for a very small bet to try and entice us to call with just a jack after he made his hand. Or it's also possible that he has air, but I do decide to let this one go and keep my chips to fight another day. Not really sure if I like the way I played this one. Let me know in the comments below what you would have done. The $10 straddle is on in this next hand by yours truly on the button. The action gets over to the low jack and she decides to raise $245 pre-flop. She's a pretty solid player, so I expect this to be a premium, either ace, king, or jacks or better. If I re-raise her pre-flop and she has jacks or queens, she's not going to call, and then if she has aces, she's just going to shove. She also isn't going to call with just ace, king either. So I do elect to just call here. Small blind comes along for the ride as well, and the big blind gets out of the way. 3 of us going to this flop here with 138 in the middle. The board runs out an absolute dream, king 9-7 rainbow. At this point, the low jack continues for $95. I'm looking at her stack size and she doesn't have that much left behind. There's no draws on the board to really be afraid of, so we just call here, assuming she's going to put the money in on any river card. Small blind gets out of the way. There's 328 in the middle. The turn comes a 3 of clubs. As expected, she goes all in on this turn. We snap it off. We show our kings and they are good. We never saw what her whole cards were, but she mentioned that she had aces, and I actually believe her because she never takes this line unless she has an absolute monster. But this hand would have played the exact same on a bunch of different runouts. I just got fortunate and we ended up hitting a set against a bigger pair. For this next hand, we looked down at 7-8 suited on the button. There was a $15 open from the low jack that we just flatted here. Small blind calls, big blind calls. Under the gun had called 3 initially. but decides to call the additional 12 as well, closing the action. We go 5 ways to this flop with $75 in the middle, and the board runs out 959 rainbow. We have 8 high here and a gutter to the straight with any 6. The action checks over to the low jack, who continues here for $40. I don't think that she hit this 9. I think it's a lot more likely that she just has 2 Broadway cards. So for those reasons, I do put in the call with intentions of betting the turn to hopefully get her off the hand if she checks it. And to my surprise, the small blind ends up coming along. Big blind gets out of the way. 3 of us still left in the hand. 195 in the middle going to this turn, which comes the ace of spades. Now we have a little bit more equity in this hand. The action goes check, check, gets back to me, and I decide to continue here for $80. Looking back at it now, I probably should have gone a bit bigger. I think 125 or 130 would have been a better bet sizing. The small blind puts in the call. Low jack ends up folding, so we go heads up to this river, which comes a 3 of hearts. And if our opponent checks it one more time, we're going to have to go pretty big here to try and seal the pot, but that is not the case. Our opponent ends up leading out themselves for $175. It's about a half pot size bet, and I'm looking at what our opponent has behind. He basically put half of his money in the pot already, so I don't think if we shove here, we're going to be able to get him to fold, and we have absolutely no showdown value. And obviously our 8 high is going to be no good if he calls. So I do ultimately elect to fold here and just let this one go. This feels bad because this is now the 3rd or 4th time I've had a pretty good drawing hand, missed it and just didn't go for the bluff. But this case was a little bit different because we were in position and the other player led into us. I had every intention of going for the bluff on this river if our opponent had checked. So tonight seems to be the night of suited connectors and suited one gappers because we keep seeming to get them over and over again. Anyhow, this time we are on the cutoff. There's a $20 bet behind us. 1 player called and we're off to this flop 3 ways. $64 in the middle, and the board runs out deuce 3 ace with 2 diamonds. Best case scenario board for our hand. Hopefully one of our 2 opponents has an ace and wants to start putting money into this pot so we can start building it for when we hit our flush. The under the gun player decides to check here. The hijack continues betting here for $25. I very quickly put in the call, and the under the gun player comes along for the ride. Jack of hearts doesn't change too much on this board. There are no straights available, but ace jack did just improve, as did pocket jacks. Don't think anybody here has the jiggities with how the action went pre-flop though. Action checks over to the hijack once again. This time he continues for $75. We think it over for a little bit, but obviously we're going to put in the call here with our flush draw. At this point, the under the gun player decides that he can no longer continue and decides to return his cards to the dealer. 289 in the middle, and the 6 of diamond peels off. We hit our flush. The action is on our opponent. He tanks for a little bit and then checks it over to us. Obviously, we're going to bet here, but we don't know for how much yet. Do we want to keep it small to get him to call with his single pair holdings, or do we want to get greedy and go for the maximum? I do something that is neither of those options and go with a bet sizing that's somewhere in the middle, which to me just smells way too value heavy, so I don't expect this to get called a lot of the time. Probably should have made it closer to 100, maybe 125 on the bottom end of it, or just gone all the way to 300 or 350, basically saying I have a flush or I have nothing. Our opponent does end up folding here, so I think we left a little bit of money on the felt, but not going to complain about winning a pot. We saw it from suited connectors to a premium. We looked down at ace queen offsuit. We are under the gun and raise it up to $12. Player immediately to our left folds. Shelby decides to put in a raise. The action folds over to me, and this hand is too good not to see a board with, so we call the $45 here. I'm going to go heads up to this flop. 74 in the middle. Board comes out king, king, 9 with 2 spades. We do have the ace of spades, but that doesn't really mean too much on this board texture. I check over to Shelby. He puts in a quick check back. The king of diamonds peels off on the turn, now making it far less likely that either of us has a king. He decides to bet $25 here. I think it over for a second, but end up making the call. 124 in the pot now as we go to this river, which comes a 3 of hearts, changing absolutely nothing. I check it one more time, and when the action is back on Shelby, he decides to size up quite a bit here and goes for a bet of $100, nearly what's in the pot, and now I go into the tank. This isn't a crazy large pot, but I'm really trying to figure out if we have the best possible hand here. As far as ace highs go, obviously we're losing to ace king, but considering there's 3 kings on the board, that's very unlikely. It's possible Shelby has the same hand like ace queen, or what's more likely is for him to have ace jack or ace 10 here, or a pocket pair. So I'm trying to figure out at what frequency he's doing this with just a worse ace high. I think if he had a pocket pair, he may have started betting a little bit sooner, maybe on the turn. So I don't expect him to have a very big pair in this situation. In the end, I decide that it's 50-50, decide to call him off here just with ace high, and he shows me 9-5 suited. So he flopped second pair, turned to boat, and went for value on the river, figuring that we probably didn't have a king or a pair bigger than his nines. Well played, sir. That was the perfect bet sizing. If you bet any more, I was definitely folding. All right, for this next hand, we looked down at Jack 10 suited on the small blind. There was a $20 open by the cutoff. The button called. Obviously, we called. Big blind got out of the way. And then the low jack put in the call. So we got 4 of us going to this flop, $83 in the middle, and the board runs out 3-5-9 rainbow. At this point, we don't really have anything, just a backdoor straight draw. I go ahead and put in a check, and the action checks all the way around. So at this point, I'm thinking it might be a good opportunity for us to try and steal this pot. As long as no Broadway cards hit the board. 4 of diamonds peels off on the river. This is an absolutely great board for the blinds as opposed to the middle or later position players. So I decide to fire here for $50. The low jack thinks it over for a little bit, but ends up putting in the call, which I find highly concerning. The cutoff ends up throwing his cards in the muck, and the action gets back to the button. He puts in the call as well. 233 in the middle, and after we got called in 2 places, I was planning on giving up, but by some miracle, we hit the 10 of clubs on the river, and now we actually have top pair with a reasonable kicker. Instead of waving the white flag, I decided to fire here for $125. About a half pot size bet. This is entirely for value. I'm not trying to scare anybody off with this bet sizing. I assumed that one of our opponents had at the very minimum at least a 9 and was going to have a hard time getting away for this amount. But unfortunately, I was wrong because the low jack folds after thinking it over for a minute or so, and then the button also tanks for quite a bit, but ultimately does elect to fold as well. We end up taking down this $233 pot. This next one is a doozy. We got Queen 4 suited, and the action folded over to us, so I decided to get cheeky here and raised to $15, and then we got called by the button. Rather unfortunate, but you know what isn't unfortunate? Lopping a flush draw. It's a $34 pot. There's not too much in there. We add $10 to the fire and then get called by the button, Mr. Mikey. And then we just drill the flush on the turn. This pot is absolutely tiny, but you know, we're going to go for a $20 continuation bet here. Now that our flush is here, Mikey should be calling us with any sort of top pair holdings or 2 pair holdings in this spot. He might potentially have a smaller flush himself. Hopefully he doesn't have a king high flush. And when he raises us to $60, I suspect this may or may not be the case. Anyhow, we can't fold the flush, especially not the second nut flush for this amount. I put in the call. 8 of diamonds peels off on the river. Now pairing the board and increasing the amount of hands that we're losing to. Mr. Mikey takes some time to think over how much he's going to bet here. He ends up firing 75, which is about half the pot. I don't think he has the flush, and I can't imagine he checked a set on the flop, especially not a set of aces or a set of jacks. So I decided to raise him to 200 here, and then he immediately clicks it back to 400. I announced this is going to be so gross, expecting him to have a full house here. I think I was a bit tilted at this point in the night, not quite sure why we called it. Anyhow, we call his bet, and he shows us quads. Absolutely disgusting. This was just a full tilt moment here. We were playing an absolutely tiny pot. I knew better than to raise somebody on a paired board with the flush. And then when we got re-raised, that was our cue to book it and run. But instead of running away, we just put chips in the middle. So rather unfortunate, highly unnecessary. This pot was like 150 when we got to the river, and it somehow ballooned to 954. So of course we had to add on for some more chips, 700 to be exact, to give ourselves some more firing power and hopefully get unstuck here in this session that we're playing a bit questionable, to be honest. I feel like we're getting looser and looser as the night progresses, but hopefully we can reel it in. All right, this next one is quite a big one. The $20 straddle is on by yours truly, and we have King 10 suited on the button. We're currently playing six-handed because the night is getting late. The player on the cutoff decides to bump it up to $60 here. Considering we're suited and somewhat connected in position, I go ahead and put in the call, hoping one or two other players come along for the ride, but unfortunately we lose both the blinds, so we're going heads up to this flop. 124 in the middle. The board comes out pretty good for our hand. It's 9-8 queen with 2 diamonds. We have a gut shot to the straight along with our flush draw. Our opponent checks it over to us. He's gonna have a lot of overpairs on this board here, potentially pocket jacks, pocket tens, sometimes pocket queens, but unlikely since there's a queen on the board, pocket kings, pocket aces, and a lot of ace king and ace queen. I decide to fire here for $45, and the villain in the hand very quickly re-raises us to 125. This is a pretty substantial check raise, so I'm expecting overpairs or sets a lot of the time. The problem is pocket nines or pocket eights I don't think take this line. I guess it's possible for him to have had pocket queens, but I don't think queens need as much protection. Anyhow, we do end up putting in the call. 375 in the middle, and the turn is a jack of spades. Now, I'd expect our opponent to slow down with a lot of his holdings, whether he has ace queen, an overpair, or even a set here, because now there's 4 to the straight on the board, but that doesn't seem to be the case. He decides to continue here for $200. Now, I'm very heavily debating if he does have a monster that he's trying to protect with this bet sizing, because if so, we currently have the nuts, so we can go all in and get all the money in now. But after mulling it over for a while, I don't think it makes sense for him to continue on this card here regardless of what his holdings are. So I just go ahead and flat call here, expecting our opponent to blast off on the river with any hand that he currently has. 775 in the middle, and the 8 of diamonds peels off. Our opponent thinks about his decision for a few seconds, but then announces all in. We snap call him with our flush. Not that we needed the flush, but we're going to do it with the straight regardless. Our opponent announces that he has ace high and shows us the ace of spades, and we end up scooping this $1,800 pot. And a couple hands since that last one, so we're definitely up a couple $100 at this point in the session. Look down at ace 10 suited. Our boy Shelby raised to 25 on the button. We got one caller in the blinds, and when the action gets back to me, I say screw it, why not? This hand is good enough. $78 in the middle, and we go to a board that comes queen 9 jack with 2 hearts. We flop the bottom end of the straight. We don't have the nuts, but I do expect us to have the best hand here. Blind checks it over to me. I go back and forth between betting and just checking here, but I do decide to go for a small bet of $20. The action gets back over to my boy Shelby, and he does not disappoint. He decides to raise it up to $80. Small blind ends up putting in the call, and when the action gets back over to me, there is now enough money in this pot for me to feel comfortable raising. Yet again, I know this looks super strong, but I'm honestly cool taking what's in the middle now because we're about to get up and leave because it's getting late anyway, and we're already up for a good amount for the session. So I decide to re-raise it to $300, trying to take down the dead money in the middle and price people off of their draws. Shelby tanks for a little while, but eventually ends up getting away from his hand. Told us after the fact that he folded ace queen. Good lay down on his part, but we were screaming that we have a monster. The player on the small blind then smiles at Shelby and tells him that he needed him to call, which indicates to me that he either has the straight or the flush draw. Most likely the flush draw, since we are blocking the straight. He ends up going all in for 600 and some change. I'm not going anywhere considering he is on a draw, or at least I think he's on a draw. I'm hoping he's on a draw. Anyhow, all the money is in the middle, 1378 to be exact, and we go to this run out. The turn comes clean, an 8 of diamonds, but then the river unfortunately is a queen of hearts, and before the cards get flipped over, I already know. Small blind hit a flush, and we just lost all the profit that we had for this session. Sucks to suck, but if we would have won this hand, we would have been up 4 figures for the session, so can't complain about it. Got the money in good, and the run out was not in our favor. Rather unfortunate that we weren't able to book a win for that last hand. We were in for 1500 on the session, and we ended up cashing out 1400 after that hand. Unfortunately, the table broke and it was time for everybody to go home. But not to worry, guys, because there's always plenty of action here at Outlaws on Thursdays. Pretty sure this is going to be coming out on January 2nd in the AM hours. So if you guys are watching this today and you guys are free tonight, please feel free to stop by. I will be there from 5 p.m. onwards. All right, thank you guys for stopping by and checking out the video. I'll catch you all next week, and good luck on the felt.